Okay, hello. All right, one more Leibniz lecture. We're done. Um, yeah, so this reading was mostly about this interconnected set of issues, right? About the problem of evil, freedom of the will, uh, predestination, responsibility, that is like why it's just to reward or punish us. Um, Teleology is like final causes, and these Christian things like grace and election and original sin. Um, and also connected to all of those is the issue of personal immortality, right? So all those things are Leibniz is trying to solve all kinds of problems about those things together. Um, um, and he wants to solve them. So as usual, like he wants to find a solution that's metaphysically satisfactory, right? But he also wants to explain how, like, well, for one thing, both Protestants and Catholics can be right about something that they're arguing about. But just generally speaking, he wants his explanations to match to serve as interpretations of his predecessors. Um, okay, so there's like several important moves here. Um, um, so the first one is the distinction between the principle of contradiction and the principle of sufficient reason, or that is between necessary and contingent truths. I don't even know what that's about, but it's all right. Actually, it looks like it might be set theory, but we never saw any set theory before. All right. Anyway, so right, the principle of these are the two great principles according to Leibniz. Principle of contradiction and the principle of sufficient reason. So the principle of contradiction is that a contradiction can't be true. And so what violates the principle of contradiction is something impossible. Absolutely impossible. I mean, one of Leibniz's problems here is to explain how there's uh, like different senses of impossible and necessary. Um, uh, that just because we can be certain something will never happen doesn't mean it's absolutely impossible. We can be certain that something will never happen for all kinds of contingent reasons, right? So, like, if you know the beginning state of the universe, or you know the state of the universe at some time, and you know how it develops, and you can figure out that a certain, so this was the initial state A, and you can figure out that in this development, a certain state B will never occur, then you're sure it will never occur. But since it wasn't necessary for this state to be A, it's that state B isn't absolutely impossible. It's only hypothetically impossible. It's impossible given A. Some people are not looking happy about this distinction. Is there a question about this? No? Okay. So, so how can you tell if it's absolutely impossible? And Leibniz says the only way is if it's like not self-consistent, right? So if the description of B involves a contradiction, then you can know that the state B will never, not will never happen, but could never happen. Even if things had gone differently, it wouldn't have happened. Um, so that's absolute impossibility. And and therefore, therefore what follows from the principle of contradiction, maybe I should have left more space here. I don't have to want to write principle of sufficient reason again. Dilemmas. Well, I'll just write it small. The consequence of the principle of contradiction is absolutely necessary. Right? So this is something whose negation involves a contradiction. So like if for some reason it would be a contradiction for a certain state B never to come in this series, then it's absolutely necessary that the state B occurs in this series. And you don't have to know where it started or anything, because you know that if B wasn't in it, that would be a contradiction. That's absolutely impossible. And so B has to be in it. That's absolutely necessary. I mean, of course, like you can't really do this with states or something, right? Like that example, like will never happen according to Leibniz, but that's what something absolutely necessary is like. Um, um, as opposed to the principle of sufficient reason. So what violates the principle of sufficient reason is contingently false. Yeah, I mean, so it may be you can call it impossible in some weaker sense of impossible. It's not absolutely impossible, but it's impossible, let's say, given our information or given this initial state, right? It's hypothetically impossible. That's the same thing as contingently false, according to the principle of sufficient reason. Because the principle of sufficient reason says that if something is one way and not another, there must be a reason that makes it that. So, although this thing is not necessarily false, it's not impossible, absolutely. There must be something else in light of which it's impossible. That's um, it's the reason it doesn't exist, right? Um, Otherwise, it would have to exist, or it would have to be true if there was no reason it's false. I think Leibniz agrees with that. This is something you probably don't remember this, but in Spinoza, like he states something like the principle of sufficient reason, but then later on he uses this, where he just says that without a determining cause, nothing can exist, or something like that. But then later he uses the Stronghold principle that also if something doesn't exist, there has to be a cause that it doesn't exist. Um, um, does Leibniz agree with that? No, maybe not. Maybe he does. I guess he does. Yeah, that's why a violation of sufficient reason. Violation. Okay, sorry, I'm getting myself confused here. I'm thinking about this wrong. So like the sense in which this violation of the principle of sufficient reason is something contingently false is like if um, if it did exist, there would have to be a cause that makes it exist. Um, so if there is no cause that makes it exist, then it's contingently false that it exists. I'm sorry, was that too complicated? Like, um, um, like, uh, if this pen were to suddenly leap into the air right now, there would have to be a reason it did that, right? It can't just happen. There has to be a reason. That's the principle of sufficient reason. So if there is no such reason, then it's false that it jumped into the air. But it's contingently false unless there be some contradiction in there being such a reason. Right? So like the reason could be that, I did this, right? So like there's no contradiction in me doing this, and therefore, since I didn't do it, it's false that it's leaping into the air right now, but it's not impossible. There's no contradiction in it. That's what a violation of sufficient reason looks like. Um, and as a violation of sufficient reason isn't something that happens without a sufficient reason, because nothing happens without a sufficient reason. But it's something that if it did happen, would be a violation, would happen without a reason, and therefore it doesn't happen. But it's only contingent that it doesn't happen. All right. So and therefore a consequence of the principle of sufficient reason. Something that can't be false, or else there would be a violation of the principle of sufficient reason, is contingently true. Right? It's true, but it's not absolutely impossible for it to be false. Um, so in particular, a consequence of the principle of sufficient reason is supposed to be that this is the best possible world. um, because well, and it's hard to know which thing to put first here, but uh, how does God decide what to do? So we decide what to do because we have private interests that we want to satisfy, right? Uh, I mean, that is, we need things that we don't have, for example. Or also we have things that we wish we didn't. Both of those things. And so, uh, like Burden's ass, I guess it has longer ears than a horse. It's more like a gazelle. But anyway, Burden's ass, is standing halfway between these piles of food, and doesn't want anything else except food. And therefore, nothing else in the universe is relevant to it. And therefore, it starves to death because it can't act without one or the other of those being sufficient to move its will. So, but God doesn't have private interests, right? Because God doesn't need anything. So how does God decide what to do? That is, what's the principle of the divine will? So Descartes' answer to that was the divine will is absolutely indifferent. I mean, uh, that's the answer he gave in the objections and replies when someone asked him about the indifference of the divine will and the indifference of the human will and so forth. Like, how to reconcile that with other things in his philosophy is a little bit complicated, or in exactly what sense he means that, right? I mean, doesn't mean that God might just as well deceive me as not, obviously, or else the whole proof in the meditations wouldn't work. Um, but in any case, the official answer is there is no principle of divine will. It decides arbitrarily, which just means freely, but right. I mean, anyway, it decides without a reason. Spinoza's answer was um, also there is no principle of divine will because God does everything possible. Um, so, right, and that's why he said, although God is free, God doesn't have a free will. Um, so, uh, but by taking these things apart, um, Leibniz is able to supply a principle for the divine will. Among all the things that are possible, there's only one of them that's uniquely eligible, namely the best possible. Um, and so that also shows why the divine will is free, right? So we're not talking about the freedom of the human will yet, but we are talking about the freedom of divine will. Divine will is free because, and like there's two things that Leibniz wants to get in here at least. One is that, well, three things really, I guess. One is that being free means acting from your own nature and not being constrained by something alien. Another is that being free means not being necessitated or constrained. And actually, maybe this is the same as the first one. Or is it supposed to be a consequence of the first one? It means acting for a purpose. Right? Because if nothing alien determines me and I'm in no way constrained, but my actions don't serve my purpose, then I'm not really free. I'm just random. Right? Like, I mean, that's actually that's the heart of what's so hard about the problem of freedom of will. It seems to be a contradiction. I think I've said this before, right? What you want out of it is you want all the actions that you take to be your actions. Um, but you also want there to be nothing that forces them to be one way rather than the other. But if nothing forces them to be one way other than the other, how could they be your actions? Like your past state must have forced them to be one way or the other. Otherwise, you weren't doing anything at all, right? It's um so uh right. So um we Leibniz can secure all of those things for God using this scheme, right? That is, God acts purely from his own nature and for his own purpose, which is um, the purpose of choosing the best. And I mean, that purpose is kind of like the only purpose God could have, again, because he doesn't have private interests. Right? Um, so it's a purpose that flows from the divine nature. And it's for that purpose that God acts. And he could have acted otherwise. It wasn't impossible for him to create one of the other worlds. That's why we call them possible worlds, right? So this is the best of all possible worlds, means the other worlds are also possible. They're just not actual. If they existed, they would violate the principle of sufficient reason, but they wouldn't violate the principle of contradiction. So just like the simplest variation on our world, have all the same monads except one of them is missing, right? Now all the monads that are left are deceived. Is there a contradiction in that? No. Right? Because monads are substances and they can be thought through themselves. And they exist through themselves, except for their dependence on God. Right? So one of them can definitely be missing without, and the other still be there without any contradiction. But that world violates the principle of sufficient reason. There's lots of worlds that are just as bad as that one. How would you decide which one? This monad missing, this monad missing. Okay, so that's the answer to divine freedom against Spinoza and Descartes. And I mean, it's supposed to answer the arguments in Spinoza and Descartes against God having that kind of freedom. I mean, especially in Spinoza, right? Because remember, Spinoza, um, um, well, you probably don't remember, but Spinoza, because I don't think I said anything about it at the time, but Spinoza actually discusses this Cartesian position that God acts purely arbitrarily. And he says, although that's better than the view that God acts for the good, right? It's closer to the truth. It's also, wrong, and he argues against it. The view that God acts for the good, Spinoza says, we think of God that way because of our own insatiable greed. Right? We tend to see everything in the world as being for us. And we start thinking of God as someone who's done stuff for us. And that's why we call him good, because remember, good means like adds to my power. And then when we see that not everything worked out the way we wanted to, we say, well, we're being punished. So God is still acting for the good. But Spinoza says none of that makes any sense, right? So Leibniz is trying to say, no, it does make sense. And moreover, it's true that the whole world was made for us. Not only for us, but, right, that is, it's false that the whole world was made just for me or just for human beings or something like that. But it's true that the world in its entirety was made for me and for human beings and for every other monad. Right? Every part of the world was made for every other, or the whole world was made for every part of it. Um, um, okay, so are there questions about that? Yes, there are.
Like, I guess that's kind of a question because I'm just like, what is the point that, like, if we're gonna say like, oh, like these, like nature and all this stuff is like the world because it's like something like the earth, then I'm just confused. I guess, does that question make sense, or should I clarify it? It's basically just like,
Yeah, I'm not.
you're made, like live in this world, basically.
Oh, well, I mean, everything in this world was made for everything else. Yeah.
kind of intertwine everything. I got it.
I mean, I think I know what you might be asking. So, because like on the surface, it seems like there isn't a problem like that, right? I mean, like, um, say there's just three things in the world, this thing, and this thing, right? And suppose these are the two best things for this thing to perceive. And these are the two best things for this thing to perceive, and these are the two best things for this thing to perceive. So obviously, it makes sense to say that the world was made in its entirety for each. Um, and then just multiply that by infinity, and then you get what Leibniz thinks the world is like. Except the things in it are monads, not actually bodies, right? But you can think of it as made as bodies, right? I mean, it's a consistent way of thinking of it as made as bodies if you want. So, but I mean, I think there is a deeper question here about what the states of the monads actually are, right? So like the states of this monad are perceptions of all the other monads. So that means that every monad is perceiving the same object at the same time. So why are they different from each other? And the difference is just supposed to be in the clarity and distinctness of the perception. And when you think about it, it can get confusing. Like, so what lies at the bottom of this? Like, this is clearly and distinctly perceiving this. But what is this? It's just a relatively clear and distinct perception of this.
Kind of where we.
Is that where you're going?
Yeah.
Yeah. That, so I mean, yeah, um I mentioned this also in the Hegel seminar because I thought Hegel might be saying this about Leibniz at some point. Meaning, I think it's not an easy question for easy problem for Leibniz to solve, and I'm not sure I understand what. I feel like it must have occurred to him. Maybe that's, I don't know, but I feel like it must have occurred to him, but I don't understand if so what he says about it. Like, where does the content come from to begin with? Um, um, yeah, I mean, every monad is characterized by its own essence, but its essence is just the like conatus, or like the endeavor to acquire its own future states. So if you can't say what the content of the states is, then you can't say what the content of the conatus is either, I'm afraid. Yeah. I mean, like, I guess all I can say about that, well, I can say two more things about that. So one thing about it is that all the people that we've read in this class have the same problem in one version or another, right? Like, I mean, this is somehow the same as Descartes' problem of like, so what's in the bodies? What's taking up space, right? And therefore, it also reappears in Spinoza. In Spinoza, it reappears in the form of this what I call the infinite definition, right? Like this mode of extension, if you want to know which one it is, you have to give this infinite series of other bodies that determine it. But this seems to have exactly the same problem. Wait, where does the content come from? This goes infinitely far back, but right. So one thing is that, yeah, I think Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz all have a version of this problem. Leibniz has done a lot to try to solve it, but I think this question may show that actually he still hasn't got away from it. Another thing to say about this is that you know this is it's not surprising that the rationalists have this problem because where do we get specific content that's like not just defined relative to something else from sensations, right? And I mean, of course, Leibniz agrees that we have sensations, but he says they're just confused intellections, so they can't serve that function, right? They don't generate their own kind of content, right? And so, like when Kant tries to put empiricism and rationalism back together, one way you can, one motive you can see behind that. I mean, besides just not wanting to end up with the result, which we have in Leibniz, and at the end of 100C, we get the same result in Hume, that an extended substance is basically, not only aren't they any, but they're impossible. Right? So what we usually call a body is impossible. That, besides just thinking that's not a satisfactory conclusion, you can see Kant is trying to solve this kind of problem by bringing them back together. Um, Not that it's absolutely clear how that solution works in Kant either, but anyway, I'm not going to talk about Kant more now. So that was a really good question in summary. All right. Um, uh, all right. But are there other questions about divine freedom before I go on to discuss human freedom? Because human freedom is obviously more complicated. I mean, in this dialogue, um, it's they titled it Dialogue on Human Freedom. I don't think that title is, yeah, they don't always say here um, whether the titles occur, so all of these things, except the ones that were published, are taken from Leibniz's papers, like stuff that he had lying around when he died. Um, and a lot of them don't have titles, including the Monadology, right? Like the manuscript of the Monadology doesn't have a title. So someone had to decide what to call it. Um, and I just noticed I'm totally out of focus. Maybe that will fix itself again later. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. It doesn't matter if I'm out of focus, but if the board is out of focus, that's a problem. And I don't know why it's happened this quarter and it never happened before. It might be because I have the camera at a diagonal this way and it gets confused. I don't know. Anyway, sorry. So that was a long digression. This is the thing that's in this book is called Dialogue on Human Freedom. And right, they say it was possibly the record of an actual conversation. I'm sure it's not a like verbatim transcript of an actual conversation, right? Like people don't talk this way. I don't think people talk this way in the 18th century either. But it might be based on an actual conversation he had with some guy. And the guy, Baron Dobrensky, is not that bright. Right? Like Leibniz says, oh, you know all about geometry. So I'll give you an example from geometry. But it turns out that he's never heard of the fact that the diagonal of a square is incommensurable to the sides. So he doesn't really know very much about geometry. All right. But anyway, so he asks, like in um, he says, well, I have this problem about understanding the relationship between infallible divine form knowledge and human freedom. And, someone advised me to just not think about this. But Leibniz says that wasn't good advice. So, I mean, this is interesting. I mean, first of all, it's interesting specifically because, well, it's interesting, first of all, because it seems to echo that thing that Descartes said that I pointed out in the discourse, where he says that like most people would be better off following an authority. And then he says, no doubt I would have been one of them if I hadn't had more than one teacher. Um, so it starts out sounding elitist, but then if you pay attention to what he's saying, you realize that at least if you were interested enough to understand what he says there, you would not be able to place yourself in that group either. Right? Because even if somehow you didn't know that there had been more than one philosopher in history and they disagreed with each other, Descartes just told you and just pointed out that that means you can't just follow authority. You have to think for yourself. So anyway, Leibniz says, even though this guy, like I said, is not that bright, Leibniz says to him, look, like it's true that I don't think it's mandatory for everyone to think about these issues. Like, yeah, a lot of people are probably better off not thinking about this. But he says, but once the question is bothering you, it's your responsibility to think it out until you find the answer. So now Leibniz, who in this dialogue is B, is like trying to help him do that. So the first part is, it must be admitted, sir, that we are not completely free. Only God is completely free, since he alone is independent. Our freedom is limited in many ways. I am not free to fly like an eagle, nor to swim like a dolphin, because my body lacks the necessary equipment, right? So, like, the fact that human beings are finite necessarily means that we're not free in, like, Spinoza's sense, or at least in the sense that Spinoza uses at the beginning of the ethics, as opposed to the other sense that he introduces at the end of the ethics, right? So we're not absolutely free. And that applies obviously to the body, right? Like when people say, people worry about whether we have free will, they're not worried about the fact that I can't, using my free will, fly out the window. But it's true, I can't. Even if I want to, I can't fly out the window. Um, there's like very similar points are made in Hobbes and Locke and other people in the same period. So, okay, so we're not absolutely free, and it applies not just to the body, but also to the mind, Leibniz says, right? Just as I'm not free to fly out the window, I'm not free to want just anything, right? Like I'm not free. Our speaker at the colloquium today was talking about how social customs like define what is a proper breakfast food, but no custom can define a rock as a proper breakfast food because it's not edible. Right? So there's a limit on my free will. I can't want to eat rocks for breakfast because I can't eat rocks. Therefore, I also can't want to eat rocks for breakfast. Or anyway, I can't, well, maybe I can want it, but I can't act on it. Right? So that's a limit to my freedom. Um, So the question isn't going to be the question about human freedom, unlike the question of divine freedom, isn't going to be how is it that humans are absolutely free, that they can do whatever they want, or even that they can want whatever they want. Um, some things I'm capable of wanting, and others I'm not capable of wanting. And some things I'm capable of wanting, but it would be very hard to get myself to. And Leibniz says we can do that sometimes, right? Like not directly. I can't directly change my desires, but I can work on them in various ways, right? I can say, okay, I'm going to go into therapy. I'm going to read this book. I'm going to write with the idea that that will change my desires. Um, but there are limits to that. So there are things that I can never want, even if I wanted to want them. So my will is not absolutely free. So the question then is like, what kind of freedom do we have? Um, so going absolutely to the other extreme, Leibniz can explain how, in some sense, everything I do is free because monads don't act on each other. And all God does is decide which among the possible monads to create. Right? Like that's the thing that's not part of the concept, not part of the essence of the monad that has to be supplied from outside by God. Actuality. Um, Once the monad is actual, everything about what it's going to do is determined by its own essence. So everything it does is free because everything it does is its own action. And it has those other characteristics I was talking about, right? That is, it has its own action. It does it for a purpose, right? Its conatus is its purpose, which is to maintain itself in being and increase its power, or what it, right? That's like the same thing it is in Spinoza. Um, um, and Leibniz says it's not absolutely impossible for it to do something else. So, I mean, this one, that one point, I'm not sure if I understand it correctly. I mean, there's two different possible ways of understanding it. Um, I think the question is, so let's say we say like it wasn't absolutely impossible for Julius Caesar to stop at the Rubicon and turn back. Um, the way the Senate commanded him to, right? So, in what sense was that not absolutely impossible? So, one way of saying it would be that, of course, the monad that we call Julius Caesar consists of all these states, including the ones that made him cross the Rubicon. And, but what's not absolutely impossible is another monad that's similar to him up to that point, and then from then on does something else. Um, Another way of understanding it would be that the relationship between, and I mean, I lean towards this, but I'm not, because so it's hard to interpret Leibniz because of the principles of interpretation that he sets up and that he applies to himself, right? So like uh he certainly seems to say something else, but it could be that the metaphysically strict interpretation of it is this, right? But he seems to say rather that the relationship between a previous state of a monad and a future state, although it's infallible, is not one of logical necessity. Um, it's the monads are like God in the sense that God always does the best. Each monad always does what seems best to it, right? That's supposed to be the analogy. So, and seems best to it, not in, because we're not talking about rational monads in particular yet. This is true of any monad. So seems best to it in the sense that something seems good to a plant, right? Like it's not conscious of it, but it has this appetition for what from its point of view is best. And that's what it will seek infallibly. Infallibly, but not necessarily, right? Not with, it's not it's not a contradiction for a monad to choose what doesn't seem best to it, and therefore to have a different series of states. So again, I'm not sure which one of these Leibniz means. It obviously makes a big difference for understanding the details of his metaphysics. Probably doesn't make such a big difference for understanding what he says about human freedom, right? I mean, the main point is that one way or another, like, um, um, the event that we call Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon was infallibly caused by the nature of Julius Caesar, but there was nothing impossible about him not doing it. It's just a question of what you mean by him not doing it, I think. Yeah.
How do you feel is the nature?
Oh, I don't even know, but this, I mean, this makes, I mean, this, depending on whether you mean this or this, you know, like, do monads proceed by logical necessity, the way Spinoza's attributes do? Or is the principle of sufficient reason, like, operating at every step in this process, and therefore, you know, when we say that, as Leibniz does, that in every judgment, the predicate is contained, in every true judgment, the predicate is contained in the subject, meaning that, like, it's true by definition, is what we would normally take that to mean. Or in Kant's terminology, all true propositions are analytic. So, like, but if it's not true that this is really a logical necessity, then that subject being contained in the predicate doesn't really mean logical containment. And that would, yeah, that would probably change a lot of things. And like I said, it sounds like he's saying that much. It sounds like, I mean, I think, I don't know if I wrote down a quote here that I could go to. Um, I mean, you might worry even about the other solution. Like, what do you mean? Julius Caesar couldn't be exactly the same as the actual Julius Caesar up to this point and then change. So maybe this other solution isn't even good. I don't know. You have to think carefully about what it means. This is like the counterpart of Julius Caesar that didn't cross the Rubicon. But in any case, yeah, this solution is what he sounds like he's saying in a lot of places. That logically speaking, monads can choose what's not best, but that of course they will choose what seems best to them. I mean, I guess it makes a difference in this context because it makes a difference like how seriously to take the idea that Leibniz includes in the idea of freedom that I could have done otherwise. Because, like, for example, Descartes just denied that that was part of the idea of freedom, and so did Spinoza, right? Like, God couldn't have done otherwise. And Descartes said we're most free when reason forces us to affirm something. Yeah, so it does make a difference, but I'm unsure how to resolve it. But so in any case, like, whatever exactly this means, this solution is a solution for all monads. All monads act freely all the time. They're always acting for their own purpose. Nothing is constraining them, and they could have done otherwise. So Um, and this explains, I mean, this already gives an answer to Baron Dobrinsky or whatever his name was. Dobrinsky, yeah. Oh no, Dobrzinski. There's another Z in there. All right, I don't know. Counselor of State and War to Brandenburg. Anyway, this already gives an answer if the question is, how is freedom consistent with divine foreknowledge? Then I think now we have an answer to it. Right? Like God can know in advance that Julius Caesar will cross the Rubicon. Um, because God knows what will seem best to Julius Caesar at that moment, because God knows the complete essence of Julius Caesar, right? I mean, no finite mind knows all of that, but God knows all of that, and so God knows exactly what will seem best to Julius Caesar at that moment, and so he knows that Julius Caesar will do that. But that doesn't mean it was necessary that Julius Caesar do that. That's a whole different question. Right? So again, like to know whether something is true or false, you just have to know something else about the world that counts as sufficient reason. Um, but that will never show you whether it's possible or impossible, absolutely speaking. So another way Leibniz tries to explain this is to say that um, um, this is again on page 112 here. So here he's talking not about Julius Caesar, but I guess about Adam committing the first sin. I I feel like Leibniz probably doesn't take biblical stories literally. It's hard, again, it's hard to be sure because of the way he says to interpret texts, right? It's hard to be sure. But he certainly talks as if they're literally true a lot. So anyway, this sin is necessary because God foresaw it. And if God foresaw it only because it will be, it follows that it is as if one had said it will necessarily happen, assuming that it will happen. Right? That's sorry, I didn't read that very well. This right, the question is, isn't it necessary that Adam will sin because God has foreseen it? So and of course things that God has foreseen can't not happen. So it's necessary that it happen. And Leibniz says, well, sure, it's necessary that it will happen given that God foresaw it. Why did God foresee it? Because it's going to happen. So all you've said is it's necessary for it to happen, assuming it happens. Um, um, it sounds like some kind of trick, but I think with this machinery, I think he's right. It is like saying that, right? Like, I mean, because again, like everything is for everything else. Like everything is a sufficient reason for everything else. um, and um, um, so it's like um, you can predict that Julius Caesar will do that about by knowing the states of all the other monads that precede him. Because um, if Julius Caesar weren't the way they perceive him, God would be a deceiver. That is, this would not be the best possible world. That is, it would be possible for God to create it, but God wouldn't create it because he would have no reason to create it. And by the way, if you ask Leibniz, so how do you know there is such thing as the best possible world? Maybe there's a tie or something. Leibniz can say, well, we can know there is such a thing as the best possible world because look, God created a world. Right. So right, so like similarly, in a way, like we can, even without knowing anything about the essence of Julius Caesar, we can know what he's going to do by consulting all these other monads. Um, um, but at the same time, it's true that the thing that Julius Caesar is going to do is the sufficient reason for all these other monads to do what they do. So it's saying that it has to happen because of the way the world is, just like amounts to saying it has to happen, assuming it will happen. All right. If you didn't follow that, or if you don't agree with it, because I'm not 100% sure about it, um, it's it's sufficient to see that it's certainly this is one way or another is certainly a case of hypothetical necessity, not absolute necessity. Um, 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 I was also going to discuss this here. Why? I guess because here's something I can say where I'm still discussing all substances in general. Yeah.
That's Paul, or more sort of question. Why doesn't calling it conditional necessity weaken God's power? Because if God can foresee it, why not? Why isn't that not just considered necessary? If God is all knowing and foresees it, why then make the distinction? Doesn't that weaken God?
Well, so another way of putting it would be God foresees it because God decided to create this world and not some other world. You know, so
So it's like simultaneous.
yeah, I mean, it's not, I mean, so first of all, God doesn't change, right? I mean, Leibniz doesn't deny that, although he doesn't remind you of it as often as Spinoza does. But I mean, Leibniz doesn't like, um, um, and moreover, that's just a given in the philosophical tradition about God, right? So like it takes someone like Hume or Nietzsche to call that into question. Yeah. So right. So like God doesn't change. So they are simultaneous or eternal, right? I mean, the divine foreknowledge is not really about God sitting at one time and predicting what's going to happen at another time. But if so if your question is like, why isn't a limit on divine power? Okay, so there is a limit on divine power here, actually. I think this is the right answer. The limit on divine power is that God can't do something and can't make something impossible possible. And therefore also can't make something that's contingent necessary, right? Because contingent means that its opposite is possible. So yeah, so I mean, it's true that there is a limit on divine power, but it's a limit that Leibniz thinks that everyone should accept and that most everyone does accept. Maybe not Descartes. That's another question about Descartes' view about God. But most everyone accepts that, and it's because like something that involves a contradiction is not really something. Um, so, right, something that's inconceivable, absolutely inconceivable, not just inconceivable to us, um, is when you think about it, you're not thinking about anything. So it's not really a limit to omnipotence to say that you can't do that. There's nothing there to do. Um, yeah, so God can make something that's contingent actual, but God can't make it necessary.
Thank you.
All right. Um, okay, so the other thing I was going to discuss here is, I mean, I already pretty much talked about this, but about the sense in which it's right to see God as oops, sorry. That's my daughter who's now 17 when she was 3, I think. All right. You can see why I don't want to update it. You're like, mm. All right. Anyway, so um um yeah, just the which is the thing about um God having made the world for us. Right. And this he mostly discusses this in the discourse on metaphysics in this reading. Right. And he's arguing against, for example, Descartes, who says, well, and Spinoza, who say that bring final causes in physics don't make any sense. Right? There's only efficient causes. Think nature doesn't act for a purpose, is the way Spinoza puts it. Descartes says nature does act for a purpose, but the purpose is unknowable to us. um, uh, again, is that consistent with saying the divine will is absolutely arbitrary? I don't know. But in any case, so whereas Leibniz says, I'm quite willing to admit that we are subject to deception when we wish to determine God's ends or counsels, right? That was Descartes' argument. Descartes said, since we don't know God's ends, we shouldn't speculate about them in physics. But Leibniz goes on, but this is only when we try to limit them to some particular design, believing that he had only one thing in view, when instead he regards everything at the same time. For instance, it is a great mistake to believe that God made the world only for us, although it is quite true that he made it in its entirety for us, and that there is nothing in the universe which does not affect us and does not also accommodate itself in accordance with his regard for us. Right? I mean, we know in what way that's true. Every monad in the universe is accommodating itself to my perceptions. Um, But he goes on, thus, when we see some good effect or perfection occurring or ensuing from God's works, we can say with certainty that God had proposed it. For he does nothing by chance and is not like us who sometimes fail to do the good. And then, so this, he analogizes this to something about textual interpretation or also political interpretation. That is why, far from being able to fall into error in this, as do extreme politicians who imagine too much subtlety in the designs of princes, or as do commentators who look for too much erudition in their author, right? So these are the two cases: the conspiracy theorist who like thinks there must be a reason for something, everything the politician does, and reads too much into it. Whereas in fact, the politician is a finite human being and like they're they have only a limited justification to offer for what they do, right? They haven't thought of reasons for every single thing. Um, and similarly is the interpreter who takes a text and starts finding hidden messages in it. So Leibniz says, yeah, those people are making a mistake. But he says, but you can't make that mistake with respect to God. Anything you find that looks like a good reason for God to do something was part of his reason. Similarly, this implies that when you read a text as a divine text, and like as in the Tractatus Theologico Politicus or the Theological Political Treatise, um, Spinoza um, pretty much implies that every text is a divine text and it's a matter of how we use it that makes it divine, right? Um, whether we find the moral law in it or not. Um, Leibniz also seems to be hinting at that. Right? Because, I mean, after all, every text is a divine text, right? I mean, like God doesn't have a mouth. God caused all books in the same way. So, I mean, then there's a question. So, but does Leibniz think that there was a fiery mountain and Moses went up and whatever or not? And like I said, I'm not sure about that. But certainly Leibniz thinks that whatever you find, you can read as a divine text. And then there's no danger of overreading it. Um, Okay, so it's true not only that every monad is free in a certain sense, but also that every monad can see the world as made for it and as treating it justly. So that thing that Spinoza says is superstition about thinking that the good things that happen are good because they're good for us, and the bad things that happen are punishments. Leibniz says that's true. Every good thing that happens to you is happened because it was good for you, and every bad thing that happened to you happened because um well, so is this part true of all monads? Maybe I shouldn't say that. I mean, every bad thing that happens to a monad happens because the world is better off. Um, individual justice maybe doesn't apply to non-rational monads. So maybe I went too fast there. But okay, I mean, this much applies to all monads. The world was made for me, I'm free, etc. So the further question is to explain what like higher degree of freedom rational beings have and why it makes us responsible. Like why we're not just capable of malfunctioning, so to speak, but we're capable of sinning. Um, so so what is a rational monad? I mean, so a rational monad has a certain kind of self-consciousness that other monads don't have. Um, what does that have to do with being rational? So apparently the answer is that a rational monad is able to follow arguments. And because it's able to follow arguments, it's able to prove that it exists. Right? So like every monad exists, but only a thinking monad can say, I think, therefore I am. Um, um, that's the connection between rationality and self-consciousness, I think. Right. So, I mean, of course, that doesn't mean that every rational monad sits down and writes Descartes' meditations, but every rational monad rationally knows of its own existence, whether it realizes it, whether it explicitly carries out that argument or not. And therefore, it also knows, whether it realizes it knows this or not, it also knows other necessary truths that can be deduced from that, like the existence of God. So, I mean, no, I can never find the monadology when I need to. Here it is. Um, no, I can't find the place where he says this now. For some reason, I didn't write it down. But, well, okay, so here, I mean, he does say that rational somewhere that I didn't write down and I can't find now, that rational monads know necessary truths like the existence of God. Um, but he also says, and this is section 83, among other differences which exist between ordinary souls and minds, some of which I have already noted, there are also the following: that souls in general are living mirrors or images of the universe of creatures, but that minds are also images of the divinity itself or of the author of nature, capable of knowing the system of the universe and imitating something of it through their schematic representations. Schematic representations is a pretty loose translation of what he says in French, and that's why they give you the French in brackets here, but it doesn't matter, I don't think, for our purposes. Each mind being like a little divinity in its own realm. I mean, what does this mean? So, like, it means that the rational monads have some understanding of, because they can know metaphysics, they're able to gain some understanding of why God created the world, right? Like of why this is the best possible world. Um, that is, they're able to understand something about what's better and what's worse. The non-rational monads just blindly seek what seems best to them in some sense of seeing, but the rational monads have a limited capacity to actually think about what's best and try to demonstrate it. And again, of course, most of the time this doesn't happen by axioms and definitions and whatever, but it happens by thinking about, what should I do next and so forth. Um, uh, um, However, this doesn't mean that rational monads always choose what they think is best. Rather, like all monads, they always choose what seems best to them overall, right? So, most of which is the usual confused impression, right? There's just this limited, so we are getting back to something like Descartes' explanation, right? There's something that we have all of, and there's something else that we have less of. only it's almost reversed, right? Like, well, no, I guess it's not reversed. Maybe it's the same. The intellect is limited, but the will is infinite. That was Descartes' explanation for error. It's not true of the will for Leibniz, because by will, he, like following Aristotle and a lot of other people, although contemporary Aristotelians will say that there's no word in Aristotle to be translated as will, and we shouldn't talk about that. But that's not what Aristotelians thought. So, um, according to Aristotle and everyone, will means a rational appetite. So, like Leibniz agrees with Spinoza that the will, in that sense, is just as limited as the intellect. But beyond that, there's this appetite, this non-rational appetite. And, there's always a reason for what the monad does next, but its rational appetite, that is, its will, is only part of that reason. Right, so this is something that Leibniz discusses a lot in this letter to Cost. And I do know who Cost was, but only from their note here. He's some guy who lived in England and knew a lot of people there and translated stuff into French. All right, I mean, like new philosophers there and translated into French. So right, so this paragraph in the middle of page 194, it starts off by saying, I find that we need to be very cautious here so that we do not fall into a chimera which shocks the principles of good sense, namely what I call an absolute indifference or indifference of equilibrium, an indifference that some people imagine freedom to involve, and that I believe to be chimerical. So so he goes on to say that no, that would violate the principle of sufficient reason. Basically, every time someone decides something, there's a reason why they decided that. He says that's not, again, he says that's not logically necessary, but that it's necessary. I mean, that it's infallible. It is certainly true that in general, every time the circumstances taken together tip the balance of deliberation more on one side than on the other, it is certain and infallible that the former side will be chosen. But then he explains how this is the different cases of this. God, or a perfectly wise person. So again, I think as in Spinoza, a perfectly wise person isn't an actual possible person, right? It's an abstraction, because a monad can't be perfectly wise. So God, or a perfectly wise person, will always choose the best that they know of. And if one side were not better than the other, they would choose neither the one nor the other. But then he says the passions often take the place of reason in other intelligent substances, that is, those that are not perfectly wise. And we can always assert with respect to the will in general that choice follows the greatest inclination, by which I understand both passions and reasons, true or apparent. Right? So when this rational monad decides what to do next, there are two factors. One is what, using everything that it can understand about what will be the best thing to happen, it has reason to do. That's the part that only rational monads have. But meanwhile, since there's a lot of things it doesn't know, and since it doesn't always do what it thinks it has a reason to do, because it has other things that move it that are not rational, it's, there's something else, call it the passions, in this rational monad that can tip the balance away from reason. And you have to add up the reasons and the passions together, and then seeing which one is strongest, you'll find out what will happen. And he mentions Buridan's ass, and he says to Kast that this is not a possible, well, actually, so what does he actually say here? Yeah, he seems to say it's not possible. But still, maybe he means only relatively or conditionally or hypothetically possible. Because the question is here, like, the actual world obeys the principle of sufficient reasons, but do other possible worlds obey it or not? But so in any case, well, I guess Leibniz thinks it's literally a contradiction, maybe. That, so, okay, I'll just say, like, what are the things that rule out this situation? First of all, we can't have an ass that is only affected by these two piles of food. Because everything affects everything else. Every time something moves, no matter how far away, it affects us. And so it's going to have some effect on its will, however small. So the literal bird is ass case where you have to say that this donkey doesn't want anything right now except food. And there's exactly equal quantities of food in both places, is impossible for that reason. You know, would it be a contradiction? It wouldn't be a contradiction for there to be things that don't affect the donkey. That would just be God being a deceiver, I think. But in any case, he also says, and if you say, well, maybe everything on this side of the universe is exactly a mirror image of everything on that side. I guess you have to say the donkey is like cylinder shaped or something. I don't know. Otherwise, the donkey will break the symmetry. But so everything on this side of the universe is exactly the same as everything on this side of the universe. Leibniz says that's impossible. Because if it were true, there'd be a monad here whose perceptions were like the same as the monad here, only backwards. But what does backwards mean before we introduce space? Right? Like we're supposed to be using these monads to build up space, not the other way around. Yeah.
Also, wouldn't they just be identical?
Right. So I'm saying, so these monads would be identical. And so there really aren't two parts of the universe, right? There's only one. I think that's why he thinks it's impossible. I mean, there's a question here that Kant is gonna use against Leibniz and rationalists about chirality and like the difference between a left hand glove and a right hand glove, and but yeah, let me not get into that. All right. So okay, but still you might say, well, all right, how does this help anything with respect to because like we're really trying to get here is responsibility again, like the possibility of sin. How does this help with that? I mean, look, the monad, this is the best of all possible worlds. So all of these things added up, in fact, impelled the monad to do the best thing. The thing God wanted it to do. It always does the thing God wanted it to do. so how can it be responsible for doing the wrong thing? And the answer is, I think, that so it's true that qua natural beings, we always act as we should. Right? I mean, that is, we follow the laws of nature, meaning of our own nature. And those laws are good because God chose to create the monads to put together would make the best possible world. So we're always doing the best thing, regarded as natural beings, but regarded as moral beings, we don't always behave as we ought to, because regarded as moral beings, we ought to behave in the way that we rationally think is best. Right? So like if we take a case here where like, let's say Adam is about to eat the apple. So like as far as Adam's intellect goes, eating the apple is the wrong thing to do. In fact, God has stronger reasons, right? Unknown to Adam, according to which Adam eating the apple actually is the best thing. And I mean, so this gets Leibniz onto somewhat shaky theological ground. And in the Theodicy, he tries to bring authorities to show that that you can say this and remain orthodox, right? Basically. So that whereas actually, I guess in Roman Catholic liturgy, there's something about where they refer to the original sin as felix culpa, like happy sin, right? Because oh happy, I think the line is something like, oh happy sin that required such a redeemer, or something like that, right? So that Leibniz alludes to that, or actually quotes that in theology as a way of saying, yeah, so I mean, the world was better because Adam did that. But Adam didn't know why it was better. Based on everything Adam knew, it wasn't better. So he's responsible, right? As moral being, he failed to do what he thought was best. Even though he acted out of his own nature, he could have done otherwise. He acted for a purpose. He failed to do what he thought was best. Therefore, he freely failed to do what he thought was best. And that's punishable. And only that is punishable, right? I mean, that is, it would be wrong to think that monads can, or that people can be punished because the consequences of their action were bad. It's only if they had a bad will. Right, so Leibniz is lining up with that idea, which I mean is controversial, or but which again, a lot of philosophers from Plato on would agree with this, and it has some common sense backing to it as well. I think that yeah, you can't blame. I mean, because we know you can't blame someone for something they did completely unintentionally. I mean, sometimes we blame people for negligence or something like that, but that's rather different, right? So the point is, so what can you blame them for? And Leibniz says, well, obviously you can blame them for having a bad will. And even so here, in this case, it's the opposite. What Adam did had good consequences, but his will was bad. And I mean, in human justice, we don't punish that. Right? Some philosophers of law are worried about why that is, right? Like, why don't we punish attempted murder just as much as murder? Because the will was just as bad. But I mean, there's at least utilitarian reasons for that, probably, right? So, but in the case of divine justice, that's how it works. Um, so, okay, so I mean, I could have said other things about like more about how he deals with election and grace, and also I'll just say that the ingredients for Kant's moral philosophy are all here. Um, they just have to be kind of like turned around to get to Kant. It's the distinction between the kingdom of nature and the kingdom of ends, the infinite worth of the goodwill, the fact that a maxim must be universalizable, that there's no conflict between moral and causal law, right? Like all these features of Kant's moral view are in a way already found in Leibniz, but you have to like, yeah, I can't put it better than you have to switch everything around and then you get Kant. All right. Uh, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.